Detective Angela Matthews stood at the edge of what had once been Willowbrook Farm, watching as the forensic team marked off another section of disturbed earth with bright orange flags. The November wind cut through her jacket as she clutched the faded attendance sheets that had led them here, pages filled with the careful handwriting of teachers who had marked student after student as absent or picked up early throughout the 1985-1986 school year. What Angela was beginning to understand, as she surveyed the rolling hills of abandoned farmland 30 miles outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, was that those 8 children had never made it home at all. They had been buried here, beneath the rich black soil, by the one person their families had trusted most completely, their school bus driver, Harold Eugene Garrett. The case had been ice-cold for 38 years, a collection of missing person reports that had never been connected, because the disappearances were spread across 5 different school districts and had occurred over the course of 9 months. Each child had simply vanished on what appeared to be an ordinary school day, with witnesses reporting they had gotten onto their regular school bus for the ride home. The children ranged in age from 7 to 12 years old, all students at rural elementary schools in central Iowa, who rode buses that served farming communities where houses were separated by miles of cornfields and gravel roads. In each case, the child's absence hadn't been noticed until evening, when concerned parents called the school to ask why their son or daughter hadn't come home. Angela had inherited the cases when she transferred to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations Cold Case Unit 18 months earlier, drawn by her background in rural law enforcement and her personal connection to farming communities. She had grown up on a corn and soybean farm outside Cedar Falls, and she understood the culture of trust that existed in these tight-knit agricultural areas where neighbors looked out for each other's children, and school bus drivers were often pillars of the community. The idea that someone in such a position of trust could systematically prey on children was almost incomprehensible, which probably explained why the pattern had gone undetected for so long. The first disappearance had been 7-year-old Emma Louise Carlson on February 14, 1985, Valentine's Day. Emma was a second grader at Prairie View Elementary who lived with her grandmother on a farm outside the town of Riverside. She was described by teachers as a bright, cheerful child who loved to draw pictures of horses and always brought homemade cookies to share with her classmates. On the afternoon she vanished, Emma's teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Hanson, had noted in her attendance book that the child was, quote, picked up early for a dentist appointment. Information that had supposedly been conveyed by the bus driver, Harold Garrett, who had told the teacher that Emma's grandmother had called the school office to request early dismissal. But when Emma failed to arrive home that evening, her grandmother, Rose Carlson, called the school in a panic. No one at Prairie View Elementary had any record of a request for early dismissal, and the school secretary, Margaret Foster, clearly remembered that no calls had come in that day requesting student pickups. Harold Garrett, when questioned by the local sheriff, claimed that he had been confused about which child was supposed to be picked up early and that Emma must have gotten off at the wrong bus stop. An extensive search of the rural area around Emma's route turned up no trace of the little girl, and despite efforts by local law enforcement, the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers, Emma Carlson simply vanished without a trace. The second disappearance occurred 3 weeks later on March 8, 1985. 9-year-old Marcus James Thompson was a 4th grader at Cornfield Elementary who lived with his parents and younger sister on a dairy farm near the town of Elk Run. Marcus was known for his love of baseball and his dream of playing for the Chicago Cubs someday. He had been particularly excited that Friday because his Little League team was scheduled to start practice the following week, and he had spent the lunch period telling his friends about the new glove his father had promised to buy him for his birthday. According to witness statements collected by the local sheriff's department, Marcus had boarded bus route 47 at the usual time that afternoon, taking his regular seat near the front, where he liked to talk to the driver about baseball statistics. Harold Garrett later claimed that Marcus had asked to be let off at an earlier stop to visit a friend, and that he had allowed the boy to disembark near the Riverside Cemetery, about 2 miles from the Thompson farm. When Marcus failed to arrive home by dinner time, his parents, Donald and Patricia Thompson, began calling neighbors and friends, eventually learning that their son had never arrived at any of the locations where he supposedly might have gone. The pattern continued throughout the spring and into the following school year. 8-year-old Sarah Nicole Henderson disappeared on April 22, 1985, after reportedly asking to get off the bus early to pick wildflowers for her mother's birthday. 10-year-old Christopher David Walsh vanished on September 15, 1985, the 3rd week of the new school year, with Harold Garrett claiming the boy had requested an early stop to help a neighbor with farm chores. 7-year-old Jessica Marie Rodriguez went missing on October 30th, 1985, the day before Halloween, supposedly getting off the bus to visit friends in town. 11-year-old Benjamin Thomas Park disappeared on December 3, 1985, with Garrett stating the boy had wanted to walk to his grandfather's house instead of going straight home. The disappearances continued into 1986, with 12-year-old Ashley Dawn Morrison vanishing on February 18th, and finally, 7-year-old Tyler Michael Chen on April 14, 1986. In every case, Harold Garrett had provided a plausible explanation for why the child had gotten off the bus at an unusual location, and in every case, local law enforcement had conducted thorough searches of the areas where the children had supposedly disembarked. But no trace of any of the 8 children was ever found, and no connection between the disappearances was discovered because they occurred across different jurisdictions that didn't communicate effectively with each other in the pre-digital era. Harold Eugene Garrett had been driving school buses in central Iowa since 1978, earning a reputation as one of the most reliable and well-liked drivers in the region. He was a 42-year-old bachelor who lived alone on a small farm outside Cedar Falls that he had inherited from his parents in 1980. Neighbors described him as quiet but friendly, always willing to help with farm work or mechanical repairs, and particularly good with children who seemed to gravitate toward his gentle manner and endless supply of candy and small toys. He attended First Methodist Church in Cedar Falls regularly, served as a volunteer firefighter, and coached youth baseball during the summer months. Angela had spent months reviewing the original investigation files, which revealed that Garrett had been questioned by law enforcement after each disappearance, but had never been considered a serious suspect. The rural sheriffs who handled the initial investigations had focused their efforts on searching for the children in areas where they had supposedly gotten off the bus, operating under the assumption that the kids had either become lost in the countryside or had been abducted by strangers passing through the area. The possibility that their trusted bus driver might be systematically murdering his passengers was simply too horrific for anyone to seriously consider. The breakthrough came when Angela discovered a connection that had been missed by the original investigators. While reviewing employment records from the various school districts, she noticed that Harold Garrett had driven different routes in different districts throughout the 1985-1986 school year, working as a substitute driver to cover for regular drivers who were sick or on vacation. This meant that he had access to children from multiple schools and was familiar with dozens of rural routes throughout central Iowa. More significantly, Angela realized that all 8 missing children had ridden on buses driven by Garrett on the days they disappeared. Armed with this information, Angela began a systematic review of Garrett's employment history and personal background. She discovered that he had been fired from his position as a substitute teacher in 1977 following allegations of inappropriate behavior with students, though no criminal charges had been filed. The school district had simply allowed him to resign quietly and had provided neutral references when he applied for the bus driving position the following year. Angela also found records showing that Garrett had been questioned by police in connection with 2 other child disappearances in neighboring counties during the late 1970s, but had been eliminated as a suspect due to lack of evidence. The most disturbing discovery came when Angela obtained a search warrant for Garrett's property records and found that he had made significant modifications to his farm in 1985, including the installation of a large underground storage cellar and the purchase of heavy earth-moving equipment. Bank records showed that he had withdrawn large sums of cash throughout 1985 and 1986, ostensibly for farm improvements. But neighbors interviewed by Angela said they had never seen any evidence of major construction or agricultural upgrades on the Garrett property. Harold Garrett had died of a heart attack in 2003, taking whatever secrets he harbored to his grave. But Angela was determined to find the missing children and bring closure to their families, many of whom had spent decades wondering what had happened to their sons and daughters. She applied for and received approval to conduct a comprehensive search of the Garrett farm, which had been abandoned since his death and was now owned by an agricultural development company that was planning to convert the land into a residential subdivision. The search began on a crisp October morning in 2023, with a team that included FBI forensic specialists, Iowa State Police investigators, and anthropology students from the University of Iowa who volunteered to help with the excavation work. The farm consisted of 160 acres of former cropland that had been returning to prairie grass and scrub trees for the past 20 years. The main farmhouse had been demolished in 2010, but several outbuildings remained, including a large barn, a machine shed, and what appeared to be the entrance to an underground storage area that matched the construction records Angela had discovered. The ground-penetrating radar team began their work near the barn, where Angela had theorized that Garrett might have buried his victims in locations that would be easy to access but unlikely to be disturbed by farming activities. The technology, which could detect density variations in soil that might indicate the presence of human remains, immediately revealed several anomalies in an area behind the barn that corresponded to what had once been a fenced garden plot. The radar signatures showed 8 distinct disturbances in the earth, each roughly the size of a child's body and arranged in 2 neat rows about 50 feet apart. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the forensic anthropologist leading the excavation team, explained that the positioning of the burial sites suggested they had been dug by someone who was methodical and organized in his approach. This wasn't the work of someone acting in panic or desperation, she told Angela as they surveyed the marked locations. These graves were carefully planned and executed by someone who had experience with digging and moving earth. The spacing and alignment suggest that the perpetrator may have intended to continue this pattern for some time. The excavation of the first grave began on the second day of the search, working with painstaking care to preserve every piece of evidence. Dr. Foster's team removed layer after layer of black Iowa topsoil until they reached a depth of approximately 4 feet. There, wrapped in what appeared to be a child's winter coat, they found the skeletal remains of a small person, along with personal items that would later be identified as belonging to Emma Louise Carlson. The little girl's distinctive red mittens, which her grandmother had knitted for her that Christmas, were still intact after 38 years in the ground. As the excavation continued over the following week, the team uncovered the remains of all 8 missing children, each buried at the same depth, and wrapped in clothing or blankets that helped preserve personal items and provided clues for identification. Marcus Thompson was found with his baseball glove, which his father had indeed bought for his birthday just weeks before his disappearance. Sarah Henderson was buried with a small bouquet of artificial flowers, perhaps Garrett's twisted interpretation of her supposed desire to pick wildflowers for her mother. Each grave told a story of a life cut short and a family destroyed by the actions of a predator who had used his position of trust to access vulnerable children. The forensic examination of the remains provided crucial evidence about how the children had died. Dr. Foster determined that all 8 victims had suffered fatal head trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy, blunt object. The pattern of injuries suggested that the children had been killed quickly, possibly without warning, which indicated that Garrett had likely used his authority as their bus driver to lure them to his farm under false pretenses before attacking them. Traces of rope found with several of the bodies suggested that some of the children had been restrained, though the decomposition of organic materials made it impossible to determine exactly how long they had been held captive. Angela worked closely with the families of the missing children to inform them of the discoveries and to help them through the difficult process of finally learning the truth about their loved ones' fates. Rose Carlson, Emma's grandmother, was now 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Cedar Falls. When Angela told her that Emma's remains had been found, the elderly woman wept with relief. "I always knew in my heart that Emma was gone," she said, holding Angela's hand with fingers that were still strong despite her advanced age. "But not knowing what happened to her was the worst part. At least now I can finally say goodbye properly." Donald and Patricia Thompson, Marcus's parents, had divorced in 1992, their marriage unable to survive the strain of their son's disappearance and the years of uncertainty that followed. Both parents were present when Angela delivered the news about Marcus's discovery, and they held each other for the first time in decades as they processed the information that their son had been found. "We never stopped looking for him," Patricia said through tears. "Even when everyone else gave up hope, we kept believing that someday we would find out what happened. I just wish it hadn't taken so long." The investigation into Harold Garrett's crimes expanded as Angela and her team examined every aspect of his life and activities during the 1980s. They discovered that he had kept detailed records of his bus routes, including handwritten notes about individual children that revealed his methodical approach to selecting victims. The notes, found in a storage shed on his farm, included observations about which children lived in isolated areas, which ones had working parents who might not notice late arrivals, and which ones seemed particularly trusting or naive. Among Garrett's personal effects, investigators found hundreds of photographs of children who had ridden his buses over the years, including images that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. Many of the photos showed children in their school clothes or playing during recess, but others were more disturbing. featuring close-ups of individual children with handwritten annotations that suggested Garrett had been evaluating them as potential targets. The 8 murder victims all appeared in multiple photographs, with notations indicating that Garrett had been planning their abductions for weeks or months before carrying them out. The discovery of Garrett's victims led to a broader investigation of unsolved child disappearances throughout Iowa and neighboring states during the 1970s and 1980s. Federal investigators identified at least 12 other cases that shared similarities with the 8 confirmed murders, including children who had vanished after supposedly getting off school buses at unusual locations. While Garrett could not be definitively linked to these additional disappearances due to lack of physical evidence, the FBI opened investigations in several states where he had lived or worked prior to his time in central Iowa. The revelation of Harold Garrett's crimes sent shockwaves through the rural communities where he had worked and lived for nearly 3 decades. Many residents who remembered him as a kind and helpful neighbor struggled to reconcile their memories with the horrific reality of his actions. Margaret Foster, the former school secretary who had worked at Prairie View Elementary during the time of Emma Carlson's disappearance, told reporters that she had always felt there was something odd about Garrett's explanations for early student pickups, but had never imagined that he might be lying about receiving permission from parents or the school office. The families of Garrett's victims filed civil lawsuits against the school districts that had employed him, alleging that proper background checks and oversight might have prevented the murders. The lawsuits revealed that several districts had failed to adequately investigate the allegations that led to Garrett's dismissal from teaching, and that his driving record included several minor incidents involving inappropriate conversations with student passengers that should have raised red flags. The legal proceedings resulted in significant settlements for the families and led to stricter hiring and monitoring procedures for school transportation employees throughout Iowa. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specializes in the treatment of families affected by violent crime, worked with the victims' relatives to help them process the complex emotions that arose from finally learning the truth about their children's disappearances. After decades of uncertainty, these families are experiencing a mixture of relief, grief, and anger that can be overwhelming, Dr. Walsh explained. Relief that they finally have answers, grief that they can now properly mourn their children, and anger that the perpetrator was never brought to justice during his lifetime. The healing process will be different for each family, but having closure is an important first step. The 8 children were laid to rest in a special section of Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery during a series of funeral services that drew thousands of mourners from throughout Iowa and neighboring states. The services were conducted by clergy from various denominations, reflecting the diverse religious backgrounds of the victims' families, and featured eulogies that celebrated the children's lives rather than focusing on the circumstances of their deaths. Emma Carlson was remembered for her artistic talents and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. Marcus Thompson was honored for his love of baseball and his ambition to play professional sports. Each child was commemorated as an individual with hopes, dreams, and unique qualities that had been stolen by Harold Garrett's actions. A memorial park was established on a portion of the former Garrett farm, with the area where the children were buried being converted into a peaceful garden featuring 8 trees planted in their memory. The memorial includes a bronze plaque listing the names and ages of all the victims, along with an inscription that reads, "In memory of 8 bright lights whose lives were extinguished too soon. May their spirits find peace and their families find comfort in the love that surrounds them." The memorial is maintained by a foundation established by the victims' families and community volunteers, who ensure that the children's names and stories will never be forgotten. Angela's investigation of the Harold Garrett case became a model for how law enforcement agencies can use modern technology and interjurisdictional cooperation to solve cold cases involving serial predators. The case highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed records and sharing information between different agencies, as well as the need for comprehensive background checks and ongoing monitoring of individuals who work closely with children. Angela's methodical approach to connecting seemingly unrelated disappearances demonstrated how patterns that were invisible to investigators in the 1980s could be detected using contemporary analytical tools and databases. The successful resolution of the case also brought attention to the broader issue of child safety in rural communities, where the isolation of farms and the culture of trust can create vulnerabilities that predators may exploit. School districts throughout the Midwest implemented new policies requiring multiple forms of verification for early student dismissals and establishing better communication protocols between schools, transportation departments, and law enforcement agencies. These changes were designed to prevent another Harold Garrett from using his position of trust to access potential victims. As Angela completed her final report on the case in early 2024, she reflected on the 20-year journey that had led from 8 missing children to the discovery of their remains and the exposure of their killers' carefully hidden crimes. The investigation had required not only forensic expertise and modern technology, but also a deep understanding of rural communities and the trust relationships that both protect and endanger children in these settings. Most importantly, it had required a refusal to accept that these 8 bright, promising young people should remain missing and forgotten. The families of Emma Carlson, Marcus Thompson, Sarah Henderson, Christopher Walsh, Jessica Rodriguez, Benjamin Park, Ashley Morrison, and Tyler Chin finally had the closure they had sought for nearly 4 decades. Their children's remains had been found, their killer had been identified, and their stories had been told. While Harold Garrett had escaped earthly justice by dying before his crimes were exposed, the truth had ultimately emerged, and the 8 children who had, quote, gotten off early at his farm were finally able to rest in peace. The case served as a powerful reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, but also that determination, careful investigation, and advances in forensic science can eventually bring even the coldest cases to resolution. For Angela Matthews, it represented the most challenging and meaningful work of her career, not just because of the investigative complexity involved, but because of the 8 families who could finally say goodbye to their children and begin the long process of healing from their decades-long nightmare. The legacy of the Garrett case continues to influence child protection policies and investigative procedures throughout the United States, ensuring that the deaths of 8 innocent children will contribute to the safety of future generations. Their names are remembered not just as victims of a horrible crime, but as catalysts for positive change in how society protects its most vulnerable members from those who would do them harm.